So, where's my mouse? Can anyone see my mouse? Oh, shoot, that's why I need a pointer. Okay, oh, it should be up there. There we go. So, right here is the basic tools for V-Ray. I'm just going to go over them quite quickly, just to show you what everything's about. There's the materials toolbar. I'll show you guys how to deal with that in a bit. Options, there's a few main ones that we're going to deal with in here. It seems overwhelming sometimes, but it's fairly basic. And then this is just your frame for whatever render you have. You can also render, this is the button to make the render, and this is the button to have a render in real time, which just means that every move you make, it'll keep re-rendering everything. This is your infinite plane, which I'll tell you about, the sun, a light source, and a proxy. So we'll go over each of these in detail. But first, we just have whichever form here, a box. This plane doesn't need to be there because we're going to put an infinite plane, which is just a super large, as you can see, plane to give you a horizon line. So when we go into the materials, this is just your basic. Also, this is a trial version of V-Ray right now, so there's going to be a watermark on everything. Just disregard that. So if you want to, there's a ton of sites that you guys can get pre-made materials from. Flyingarchitecture.com is one good one that I use that has the Vismat materials, which you need for V-Ray Rhino, or Rhino and V-Ray and Rhino, sorry. There's a lot of other sites that have different types of materials that you might try and download, but unfortunately won't work with Rhino or V-Ray on Rhino. A couple other sites. Actually, there's one really good one that has a huge list of materials if you want it, and it is it's artcenter.edu. You might have to make a search for it, but just remember that all your files or all of your material files need to end in .vismat, D-I-S-M-A-T. So once we have this screen open, we can go to the scene materials, and I can load a material library or whatever I have. Sorry, I just have to find. So I just grabbed a couple materials before we started this. And you can see here, it's a Vismat file type. So I just click on it, and then it pops up, and I even have a preview of what that material looks like. So just so you have a kind of idea of what this screen looks like. There's a whole bunch of different options in here. In the actual materials themselves, they have these lists, so you can go in and make your own. Sorry, and this was in all these M's. Go to a new window, but you can go in here, and if you want to create your own with a texture or wood texture, whatever you want, go into the bitmap, and then you can go through and choose whichever images you have laid out. There's more to it than that, but if you just do that, is basically the shortest way. Actually, here, I'll try and see if we can do one really quick. Sorry, this is a bit annoying that I have to use this screen to see, but So it's a concrete texture. You can kind of see behind that watermark. So I can go in here and change, actually I'll cancel it out of that so I don't screw up this texture. But if you want to make any new texture, just always click on the scene that you're on, scene materials, load material, or you can just create a new V-Ray material. So if I were to do that, again, just go back that same way there. There. So it was as simple as that, just taking a texture that you see on the internet or whichever and just taking the JPEG, and then you can go in and actually put the bitmap in there, and then it creates a material for you. And you should probably rename them as well so that you don't get confused. Okay. So moving on to the next tool is the options panel, which you'll become very familiar with. First, when you're actually doing the renderings, you can see it's coming out in this square format that doesn't necessarily match the perspective box. So when you're in here, if you go to the options and output, you can control the file size that's going to come from V-Ray. If you get the view aspect ratio, it automatically changes it to whatever your window setup is. And then obviously, as you know, you can change all of these to get a higher quality or high resolution photo. But the higher resolution, obviously, the more time it's going to take to actually render. Now, another aspect you need for the rendering is the camera. It's a huge portion of the rendering process. Some people try to use just the automatic camera, but I don't think it really works that well, especially if you're trying to do night shots or trying to get a blown out scene or anything that you want to kind of create a nice atmosphere. It's almost impossible when you have the automatic camera. So I guess how many people are actually familiar with the settings on a manual camera, like an SLR? Yeah, okay. So it's the same idea as the shutter speed, which is, for those of you that don't know, that would be 1/30th of a second. The higher the number, the quicker the shutter speed is. And the f-stop, the lower the number, the more light it's letting in. And then all the other settings, like the ISO, you can change that as well. And I mean, these other things you don't really need to know. The depth of field, we're going to go over a different way of using depth of field. This one doesn't really work that well, and then you don't have the chance to manipulate it afterwards. So that's, yeah, just remember camera. You want your camera on, your physical camera on, just change the settings for that. And then environment. So environment is just essentially taking the sky or whatever you want, so cloudy or super sunny environment, and that's the same idea as before. You can just go in here and then choose that bitmap. So I grabbed one earlier. Okay, so just an overcast bitmap. And then just to give you, well, you can't really see too much on the preview, but you can see it's kind of this like hazy yellowish tone to the sky. But I'm actually not going to put that in quite yet, just because I want to show you the basics of it in the rendering portion. Output we went over, and another important aspect for the post-processing is the VFB channels. All of these channels in here, when you actually make a render, they'll come up in this panel, and they all hold different properties. So one of the ones which we'll go over later is Z depth. That was the alternative to using the focal thing in the camera. So that's one of the ones you might want to click on. Sorry. That's one of the ones you might want. RGB and alpha, definitely always keep those ones. So caustics, GI, lighting, material ID, all of those are beneficial because if you have in Photoshop, you can put the file right in them. It'll come up with all of those different files, and so you can take things like the materials and it will separate every piece of your render with just a block color material, so it's easily editable in Photoshop so that you can either make masks or selections. So anyways, that's a little more advanced, but just remember those VFB channels are helpful and in the post-processing. How big is it? And you shouldn't need any of these other ones. They're a little more advanced, so we'll leave those. This, again, just going over it, is just the frame, the last render that you had open. Render to render it, and then we can do a real-time render, which just means every time I change the view of this, that will change as I'm going around. Some people find it helpful. I don't, so I don't usually do that. Okay, another thing I noticed a few of you in the studio had a lot of things in your Rhino file. So if any of you are putting trees or furniture or any of those high polygon or mesh items, a proxy is really helpful, because what a proxy does is just takes basically takes all of those trees that you've multiplied and references it to another file. So it's not actually on your file, but when you render it, it will bring in the geometries. So it'll come out, so just to, I don't have a complex geometry or anything to put in here, but what I would do, so to make this a proxy, say this was a tree, you can just go here and then you want to write a proxy, so right click and do whatever file, just save it somewhere. Cancel, we don't really want that. So essentially that box has been saved somewhere else, and then I can input it multiple times through importing proxy and put it all over my file, but it's not actually in the file, so it doesn't make your file heavy and it doesn't crash it, which I don't know how many of you, yeah.
Is there any way to do that in SketchUp?
No, I don't think so. You can try, but I think SketchUp has already simplified everything to the max that it's not really meant for that. Yeah, and that's also another way. A lot of people try and put grass in, which is a pain in the ass to do, and a big, huge field of grass is just that much easier to Photoshop in and just as realistic. Okay, and then all these other things. So, for materials, I guess, actually here, I'll just go in here and kind of demonstrate the, oh, I didn't do anything with the sun. So the sun, most of you, I'm assuming, are going to do exterior renderings. So you need a sun, and you can go around and you can just play with these settings, whatever you want, but I'm assuming you're in Halifax, you want some realistic light conditions, so just take the manual control off, and you can just select here. It'll come to Halifax. Maybe not. Okay, it's taking us to Augusta, Maine. I think. I don't know. Okay, and then you just have to place it Doesn't matter where because it's the sun. So just place it on your image. So there you can see it's giving, this is the sun right there, it's giving you the direction of where it's kind of headed. But say I don't really want that, I don't want that direction. You can go back in here and go to your lights panel and it'll bring up the sun. Or select lights. If you type that in, select light, it also usually pops up layers. Okay, so let's just delete that and start over. So sometimes if you keep deleting it and starting over, you may have forgotten to actually delete it and you'll end up with a bunch of suns and it's just gonna make your rendering look ridiculous. But if you want to go in here, so once you're in there and you've selected Halifax, you can change this. Obviously, you probably all know this, the season, the time of day, to get a more yellow light or a more direct overhead light. So let's just do that for now. And then place it. Cool. Whatever. So now we have a really bright render, which does us no good. So if you go back into the camera, we just need to take a little bit of the brightness out of the camera. So we can do it in multiple different ways, but doing one way, we can let less light in the camera by changing it to f16 and then see what that's like there. So we have a little easier to read render. So you can play with those settings and decide what the brightness and everything you want. Those channels. Now, obviously it looks super weird because we have no materials on it. So we can go here and say we want to apply, and actually it's helpful to be in the rendered setting when you're applying these materials because it will show the mapping of the textures, which, those who don't know, mapping is just the texture placement and angle and repetition on an object. So here, now we need to apply the material. So if we just right click there, I had a couple materials there already. So we can just apply this test concrete that I had. And there we have that box. And let's just render that out really quick. So now that's a really odd piece of concrete. So you can go in here and in the objects panel or whatever bar, there's texture mapping. If you go in there, you can apply different types of mapping to your object. All of those are a little bit more advanced, I guess, but what you can do is you can go back and edit the material so that everything that you have is the same. Like you don't have a whole bunch of different iterations of your material. There isn't like one concrete with different spacing than the other concrete or different size bricks. So we can go in here and sorry, maps. Actually, sorry, there's an easier way to do this. Sorry guys, just give me 1 sec here. Okay. So in that actual material we created before, we have the tilings and the UVs and everything. So we can increase the repetition of it. A lot of your materials are gonna take some kind of fine tuning depending on obviously the size of your building and what materials you actually use. But if you go through here, oh, shit. If you go through the mapping process or the material mapping process in the editor, so just in this UVW type, there's the repeat. That's where you can change the repetition of this. You can see it slightly changing, but because it's just essentially 2 lines on it, it's only changing it a little bit in the that direction. And then the why is he doing this? Okay, I don't know what's going on, guys. Okay. Anyway, so in those 2 directions, you can keep multiplying or creating a smaller fraction of the number to just change the repetition of the pattern. It's not very difficult. It just takes a lot of fine tuning. There's other programs like 3ds Max, I think, that they have an easier, they can kind of push and pull everything a lot easier. But this one, it's all done through the materials palette. Great. Okay, I don't know what's going on with this. So, okay. So let's just throw another box in there. Nice. Okay. So if we go back into our materials again, they didn't save, but we can create a new material, and let's just create something simple that doesn't have an actual pattern. You can go in here. Sorry, I'll slow that down a bit. So again, right click on scene materials, create a material, and then create a V-Ray material. And then if we go in and rename it, just orange block. So if we just want an orange color or whatever color we want, we can go in here and choose just a color. And then we can, if we do want to, we can change the reflectivity and refraction of all of these things, but let's just keep it basic. So now we have that orange color. Preview it. There it is. Now we want to apply it to this box. So just right click on the material when that's selected and go hit orange. Now, if we're in the rendered mode, there's our orange box. Now, let's just add this sun back in here. So So there we can see the sun, but maybe the shadow is a bit too, well, the whole thing's a bit crazy. It's too bright. So again, just go in here, change your camera setting and options, and we want it a little bit darker. And there we go. Now it's a bit too sunny, so a way we can deal with that again is changing the environment. So in the options panel, go back in here to environment, and just like the other ones, go into the M. That's where we're going to place our bitmap. I had a preloaded bitmap of a sky. Okay. So if we go and render that again, you can see the difference that the sky made just by, oh, actually, sorry. There's 2 steps to that. I missed one. The environment. So if you have to do it to both of these, the one is just the actual light that gets through, and the other is all the reflections. So do the bitmap again, and I'm going to just put in that same exact image. The sky changed a little bit, but it's still a little bit off. You can go in and, again, with all of those different settings, I didn't test any of these before, but if you go into the options again, you can change the settings for the skylight and the sky in the background. Once you do the rendering, you'll actually have a real sky in your background opposed to just the white, which maybe you want white, you can do whatever. If you just want white, you can, again, go on the VFB channels, and one of the options in here is the background, and it will automatically take out the background for you or select the background for you in one of the files. Okay, so why don't we try and map this guy again? So materials, now we need to load another material. Let's just load actually I think I have a wood, it'll be easier to see. Okay. Now just so you guys can see what it looks like. There's our wood material. Okay, so then we can, from here, we can just apply it to the selection that we already have, and we can go in there, and we can see that it's mapping the 3 sides or the 4 sides are quite good, but then it has a different map on the top. You're going to have to go and separate these out, which you can just extract the surface. This one, sure, but then everything changes. So in order to actually do this properly, we can So we can select what we had there, just the 4 pieces. and go into mapping and do the box mapping right there. There, and then it applies it just to those selected objects. It is a little bit different than before, but you can go in there and take those objects, and again, here's the repetitions and offsets. We won't need anything offset or rotated for this, but this is where you can do it. So we have too many of those repeated. So if we just move these, change these, you can see them changing as we kind of go through. So this one's just changing the horizontal, which isn't really what we need. We need the spacing this way, a little bit like that. So you can go through and change the mapping on each of those and then deal with this mapping separately because it's in a different orientation. So if we just go to planar mapping, oops, whatever, close enough. Okay, so we can go up here and anyways, you get the idea. So you can go in here and manipulate your surfaces, whichever object you have, by the planar mapping or the box mapping. There's all these different types. You can, like I said before, in that the materials channel, you can go and actually manipulate. You can manipulate all the components in the bitmap. It doesn't have one because we didn't make it. So there's a lot that you can manipulate. Like when you make your own material, you can manipulate the repetition from it in the material so that it's all of the materials base standard like that. But with a lot of the other materials taken from online, they'll also pop up like this, so you have to map them each separately. You can also take those things and match the mapping of another object. That one's not really going to work for us because this is a different form, but in the event that you have many other objects that are spaced throughout your project, it's pretty much as easy as just multiplying the mapping by matching it. You can also add you can put lights in place as well. So if I wanted to add just a horizontal light, right now it's facing upward, which doesn't really help us. So you can, whatever, if you're inside, you can use these lights. Once you're in that, you have all of these different ones. You can turn off the sun, turn on the sun, whichever you like. But once you actually click in that light, you can change the intensities of lights so that it's not so bright in the rendering. What else can I show you guys? Is there anything else you guys don't are not sure about, or this wasn't clear?
Can you show us again where you get the materials from to map?
To map them, yeah. This is if so this is if you want to create your own material, which is kind of a pain in the ass. There are a ton online that you can just take, so you don't have to go through this process. But if you're wanting to create a material. Oops. Just go into the materials palette there, and in scene materials, right click and go to create material, create a V-Ray material, and then once you're in there, you can go and the M buttons are where you'll actually go and put your bitmap. So if you go in here and select bitmap.
Loaded materials that you have, or are they on all computers?
No, you have to go get them. And it's not hard, they're free, it's just download, but it's a lot easier if you go and just scan through which ones you want on there. There's one, I forget where I got it, but one site that just has, sorry. Whatever. Okay, does anyone see my drive there? No. Okay. But there's one you can get actual packages or collections. And there's enough materials on there that once you actually have the material, you can manipulate them. Another part of getting, another part of these materials, so okay, now it's on this screen. Anyway, so it comes with 3 different images usually. And then from that, there's bumps within it, which the bump that you put in the scene material, if you like really want to kind of go through that whole process, it's a little bit, it's a lot of work and a lot of fine tuning, but the bumps are what's going to give the depth to the texture. So you can change the black and white scale in Photoshop of the image, and then it will actually appear like the planks or the concrete is offset from the wall, and will show the texture around it and cast shadows more. So that you can do with the actual bump that you put in some of these materials. But that's complicated. Just trying to think. For the most part, I would stick to just going here with your material and bringing your bitmap in that way. That's probably if you have like some really complicated material that you can't find, do it that way. Otherwise, there's every material under the sun that you can find as a bitmap material. Yeah, I don't know. Any other questions? Obviously, there's more complexity to this than we're going over, but everyone has such specific questions on either mapping or lighting that I find it's just easier to ask rather than try and teach the specifics. Does it all make sense? Some make sense? Yeah.
I think it's enough to get started.
Okay. How many of you are doing indoor renderings? Or are you guys doing renderings? Yeah. Indoor? Yeah. So the indoor, I find probably the most, I guess the most unique ones are the ones that are indoors and the ones that are at night on the exterior, because you guys can use you guys can use lights and darkness to camouflage the imperfections in your projects. So it's it looks a lot better, and it's a lot easier to Photoshop, I find, the night scenes and create a great render. but yeah, then you're gonna just be dealing a lot with these separate lighting systems, which are pretty easy. Just remember the different lighting panel up here, and then changing the intensities of the lights. There's, again, on each of these, well, don't screw around with the sun, because it's the sun, it doesn't really change. But all the other lights, you can change a lot of the settings and spend hours on the lights. But yeah, don't worry too much about those, but they are pretty powerful if you want to use the nighttime renders or inside. Just trying to remember. Yeah, I think that's the most basic portion. So if anyone has a question or questions,
How long typically what does it take to, like, what's the scale? It can take you between minimum to maximum. What do you think?
just for it to render or for you to set it up?
Just for it to render, maybe, and set it up. I don't know.
For the render, it depends. Like anytime you guys put glass or water or anything in your renders, it's going to take triple the amount of time. And then it'll obviously increase the more water, or the more texture, the more water you have. I was doing renders over my M3 work term, and there was only like kind of a glass railing, and the detail, because the output was so large, it was like a 5,000 pixel output, 5,000 by like 8,000. It was taking the computers, which were very strong, they would run for about 9 hours overnight. But then the setup of them is probably triple that, just with like the mappings and getting all the lights right, doing all that, and then post-production on top of it. So if you guys want a really good render, I would budget 3 days.
For
But,
one image?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, 3 days for one good image, and then it's probably 4 days for two. But like once you have your model set up and the mapping all good, that's what takes the time, and then you can pump out more renders. But just remember that like this isn't going to pump out a render that, oh, that's another thing I can show you too. This isn't going to pump out a render that's like immediately you can put, well, in my opinion, that you could immediately put up on the wall. It's going to obviously require some post-processing, but the picture frame, you guys all know what that is, right? Maybe? So picture frame is a good option if you have a view. So say whatever, this is my view. I don't know which way it's facing, but you can, this was the sky that I had put in place before, or that's like, this is the sky that is the environment. But you can put, I mean, this is obviously way too large, but if you put this in the frame of your render, I mean, your guys' site is so close, you can, I'm sure you guys all have site photos that you have angles and everything that correspond with the angles in your models. So you can just place this in the saved view or whatever, and it will render the sky right behind it all. So the picture frame, you can do that with. Additionally, when you do put the picture frames on, I guess depending where your sunlight's coming from and everything, if you want to do it this way instead of actually going through and creating the environment that changes all the sun and everything, you can just put the picture frame there, and all the reflections in your water and whatever else will still take into account your picture frame that you've placed. So it is a background, but it also reflects the colors and everything that are on it. Yeah. Good. Cool. Well, let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't move too much.